All right, folks, welcome to According to Sam. This is episode 248. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you had a great week so far, and I'm looking forward to the weekend. It is officially fall. Summer is over. So we have a few more weeks of this month, and then October. And then we are a month away from the election, and this is all going to be over. It's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing what the October surprises will be. But on this podcast, we are still talking about the Bush-Clinton dynasty, and we've been talking about the Bush-Clinton dynasty for a few weeks now. And I've been explaining to you of these three presidents in the Bush-Clinton dynasty, the role that they played in the 2008 financial crisis. And there's a reason why. You're going to see more. I'm going to spend the first part of this podcast reiterating why I am telling this story, what this has to do with this election in 2024, and what the Bush-Clinton dynasty has to do with this election in 2024. You can relate Kamala Harris, who is the Democratic candidate, back to the Bush-Clinton dynasty because all of the members of the Bush-Clinton dynasty have endorsed her, except George Bush, but he's not making any endorsement, so we know what his endorsement is. It's safe to say that Kamala Harris has been endorsed by the Bush-Clinton dynasty. And what we've been talking about is the fact that the Bush-Clinton dynasty, if you include the 4 years of George H.W. Bush, who is the patriarch of the dynasty, and the 4 years of the current 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, then the Bush-Clinton dynasty has governed over the United States 32 of the past 36 years, and this guy governed for 4. And they're telling you that all of your problems, all of the division in the country, all the economic problems in the country, all the problems with immigration and the problems at the border are all this guy's fault. Kamala Harris was in this town hall event, star-studded town hall event last night with Oprah Winfrey, and she was asked about the border, and she blamed it on Trump. That guy asked her, actually, he didn't ask her. I may play the clip for you. I have it here in a moment, but it's all his fault. This guy's 4 years. It's all his fault. And I'm telling you that that's ridiculous. I'm going to explain to you why the economy is in the shape that it's in, going back to the 2008 crash, what all three of these presidents had to do with it, and how it relates to today. So in the last podcast, we were talking about how George Bush, he was the one who initiated he didn't initiate the housing crisis. The housing crisis in 2008 was initiated by the deregulation that these guys did during the Clinton administration. During the late 90s, these guys ran the economy during the Clinton administration. Alan Greenspan, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, and also Timothy Geithner, who worked under Alan Greenspan at the Fed. So these guys were running policy in the Clinton administration in the late 90s, economic policy. And these are the guys who deregulated Wall Street. They set up the crash. But when George Bush came in, he's the one who really started the process to get all these subprime borrowers into the marketplace, create all of these subprime loans that were then securitized. We talked about mortgage-backed securities and CDOs in the last podcast. And the centerpiece of George Bush's plan back in 2002, when he set this off, was down payment assistance, which is what Kamala Harris is talking about, and increasing the amount of inventory and building new units. This is all stuff that George Bush talked about in 2008 when he was creating this marketplace for the eventual crash by bringing all these people into the marketplace that couldn't afford homes, I mean, quite frankly, we're not in a position to afford homes because their wages weren't high enough. And that's the same thing going on now, that the wages aren't, the reason that people can't afford homes is because the wages aren't high enough. This is what the median price of homes has done going back to 1965 here to today. This is what the median price of homes has done. So this is inflation right here. What you're looking at in this line is inflation, and people's wages have not gone up with inflation. This is why people can't afford homes, and that's why they couldn't afford homes back in 2002. And giving people down payment assistance is not going to help them afford a home that they can't afford. All this is going to do is raise the price of homes by $25,000. And this is a tax credit is what Kamala Harris is proposing. She's not going to be giving people $25,000. This is a tax credit for first-time home buyers. So there's a lot of parallels between Kamala Harris's economic plans and what George Bush did back in 2002, all set up by these guys. In the Clinton administration, like I was explaining, and the last podcast that when Robert Rubin left Treasury in July of 1999, and then Larry Summers became the Treasury Secretary. But Summers and Rubin were gone when George Bush comes in January of 2001. But Alan Greenspan stays on. Alan Greenspan is the continuity. He stays on from the Clinton administration into the Bush administration. Bush gives him the Medal of Freeman. So this economic policy from the Clinton administration is carried on to the Bush administration. Two different administrations. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican, but you see this continuity here. And then we'll go back and listen to what George Bush says about his brother from another mother, William Jefferson Clinton. Take a listen.
Wasn't around. And I think that he thinks of George a little bit like the father he didn't have. And he's very loving to him. And I really appreciate that.
I'm doing it. My mother calls me my fourth brother. Calls him my fourth brother.
Is that right?
The black sheep of the family. May all the Democrats forgive
brother from another mother is, he doesn't say it in this clip, but he says it another time, that Bill Clinton is his brother from another mother. So from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, they are handing it off. And the economic policy is consistent because Alan Greenspan is there for the continuity. So Bush comes in, you have 9/11. First thing he does is cut taxes. He cuts taxes before 9/11. And the Fed policy drives everything, if you didn't notice this week, because Jerome Powell, our Fed chair, just 40 days before the election, he does this massive rate cut. It's not even a small rate cut. People were expecting a rate cut. And in this clip, you're going to hear she say that it's more than what was expected. This was a huge rate cut. There was a tweet from Zero Hedge that came out and says that the economy is doing so good that the Fed had to do a massive rate cut like this just 40 days before the election. Now, it's all political. We know that it's political. The national debt is still $35 trillion and climbing. Inflation is still double what it was when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And that is core inflation. Headline inflation I mean, when you include energy and food, I mean, it's still extremely high. But Jerome Powell seems to think that now's the right time to bring down the interest rates. Now, it's clearly political. The stock market, the S&P, the Dow are breaking records, reacting to this rate cut. I mean, you would expect that to happen. Of course, that's why he's doing it. It's political. It's to give Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, the edge to show that the economy is doing good before the election. Have the stock market, S&P and Dow breaking all these records, responding to this rate cut, which is just sugar. It's just sugar. That's all this rate cut is. It's stimulus is what Jerome Powell did this week. But it's just another example to show how Fed policy affects the economy and the impact of Fed policy. Now, is this good policy? We're going to see if this is good policy, but take a listen to this clip about the rate cut.
Good evening. I'm Nora O'Donnell, and thank you for being with us on this Wednesday night. There's a lot of news at home and around the world, and we want to start with the number one issue for Americans, the economy. The Federal Reserve made a big move today.
The economy is still the number one issue in this election, the economy, and the border is number two. So that again tells you why the Federal Reserve is making this political move.
By 0.5 percentage point, that's more than expected, and it is the first rate cut since the COVID pandemic in 2020 and the largest since the 2008 financial crisis. So tonight, the big question is,
this is the largest rate cut going back to the 2000 financial crisis, and you hear her say that it's larger than what is expected. That, do you really think that the economy and inflation and the national debt are in a place to where a rate cut at this time right now, 40 days before the election, is the right policy? No, it's political, people.
Rates by 0.5 percentage point. That's more than expected. And it is the first rate cut since the COVID pandemic in 2020 and the largest since the 2008 financial crisis. So tonight, the big question is, what does it mean for your credit card bills, your mortgage, your auto loans, and your pocketbook? And how soon could you feel the effects of the rate cut? CBS's senior business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent leads us off tonight with some of those answers.
After months of anticipation, the Federal Reserve today aggressively reduced the cost of borrowing for the first time in 4 years with a 0.5-point rate cut.
Our patient approach over the past year has paid dividends.
The central bank sending rates down from their more than 20-year high.
What message are you trying to send American consumers, the American people?
Vote for Kamala Harris.
Large rate cut.
Vote for Kamala Harris. That's the message.
The economy is in a good place, and our decision today is designed to keep it there.
Inflation has cooled off from its peak of more than 9% in 2022.
That's core inflation. That's core inflation. That's core inflation. And it's still double what it was when Donald Trump left office. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that the Fed has the ability to act politically. The Fed controls everything. They control the switch. They can heat up the economy. They can cool down the economy. So that's the problem. When you go back to this document, I mean, that's power. The Federal Reserve has power, people. When you can cut the rates before the election, I mean, less than 2 months before the election like this, and have this effect on the economy to where it's going to have an impact on the election, that is power. And that's another reason when you go back to the document that we've been talking about that they were passing around in secret in the final months of the Clinton administration, these guys who were passing it around, that were warning that the United States was going to pay off all of its debt in 12 years, that the United States was going to be completely debt-free, is what this secret document that was retrieved through a FOIA request is saying. So they had to fix this problem somehow. And what was the problem? I've been telling you, the problem was that there's not going to be any more usury for these guys, that sweet interest, but also the power to do what Jerome Powell just did this week, to cut a rate, to affect an election, or to raise rates, to affect the economy. That's power right there. If the United States becomes debt free, I mean, what do you need the Federal Reserve for? It's all, everything that I'm laying out for you people, I'm giving you motive. I'm giving you the documentation, the secret document that we got through a FOIA request. It's right here. It's these guys talking. I'm showing you what these guys did. But that's what the clip of Peter Schiff that I played at the end of the last podcast. I want to play it again, a little bit more of it here. But Peter Schiff, the argument that he's making here is about the Fed policy and the fact that the Fed won't allow us to learn from our mistakes and to have recessions when the market when the market principles call for recessions and downturns, and that can be healthy, for economies to not kick the can down the road. And he was one of the people that was talking about kicking the can down the road in 2008. But he's talking specifically about Greenspan, the Greenspan Fed policy. But after Greenspan came Bernanke, and then after the 2008 crash, Bernanke started stimulating the economy with rate cuts. He's talking about Greenspan here in 2001, stimulating the economy cooling down with rate cuts. And now you have Jerome Powell stimulating the economy right before the election with rate cuts. Listen to more of Peter Schiff here.
You'd have this bubble economy, it would burst. And then the government would try to blow it back up. The government would try to put air back into the bubble. Because that's the way we always have reacted in the past. That's the way Greenspan ran the Fed. Every time the economy started to contract, they intervened. They increased money supply. They slashed interest rates. They stimulated the economy. And so we never really got a full recession. We never really got to correct the imbalances of the boom because we simply piled on more imbalances and we kept sweeping the problems under the rug or kicking the can down the road. But I saw that this latest bubble that the Fed had created was going to be so huge and so enormous that there was no way to stimulate our way out of it. When George W. came into office, he came into a situation similar, just not as bad, as Barack Obama. He inherited the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble, and he inherited a recession. And, the recession would have been compounded by September 11th. So we should have had a pretty severe recession. We had to deal with the terrorist attacks. We had to deal with that loss. We had to deal with the cost of the war on terror and of securing our borders. And we had to deal with the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble, where, a lot of malinvestments were made. A lot of companies were started in the 1990s that never should have been started. A lot of people were employed at companies that couldn't make profits, and therefore those companies needed to go bankrupt, and therefore those people needed to lose their jobs. A lot of people made investment decisions, made spending decisions based on stock options that really didn't pan out, but people thought that they would. So we made a lot of foolish choices. And again, the reason that we were so foolish is because the Fed was too easy during the 1990s. Greenspan blew up the stock market bubble. It's because of the Greenspan Fed that the NASDAQ went to 5,000, that we made all these foolish investments in the first place. But when that bubble burst and George Bush came in, we should have had a very severe recession. But we didn't, because the Fed did what it always does. Greenspan did what he had done in the past. They slashed interest rates down to 1%. Now they're zero.
All right, so I want to just go and break down a little bit of what Peter Schiff's talking about here, because you did have the stock market crash, the .com NASDAQ bubble is what he's talking about. it's the peak of that bubble burst was Friday, March 10th, 2000. But there were still companies that were crashing from this bubble going into 2002 and after 9/11. Some of these companies were Adelphia Communications. Adelphia Communications failed in 2002. Despite its success in 2002, the company filed for bankruptcy. You also had Global Crossings failing in 2002. Huge company, part of during the 1999, in 1999, during the dot-com bubble, the company was valued at $46 billion. So what I'm trying to say is that these companies were still failing from the dot-com. You had Enron. Enron it declared bankruptcy in December 2nd, 2001. So this is December 2001 going into 2002 is when the Enron scandal really. So in 2002, in the first months of 2002, this is just a few months after September 11, you started having all of these, companies crashing. Enron, Adelphia, Global Crossing, WorldCom. WorldCom was the largest bankruptcy ever before Lehman Brothers ended up declaring bankruptcy just 6 years later. So from 2002 to 2008 is just 6 years, and you have all these companies crashing because of this bubble and all of this fraud, and it being a huge economic crisis. The Fed, Greenspan Fed, reacts to it by cutting rates, and that's what Schiff is talking about here, is that instead of doing that, instead of cutting rates, you should have raised rates. We should have had a long recession, and we should have, fixed the fundamentals of our economy. If we would have done that, perhaps we would have been better prepared in 2000. If we would have done that here back in 2002, when all of these companies from the NASDAQ bubble were crashing and we were heading into a recession, if we would have done that, maybe we would have been better prepared in 2008, or could have prevented what happened in 2008. But what you got to understand, 2008, it couldn't have been prevented because it was planned. It was all part of the plan. What George Bush did in cutting taxes and taking us to war and increasing the deficit spending at the same time that he's cutting taxes, the purpose of that was to handle this problem of the United States was going to be debt free in 12 years. So the plan was that, no, we're not going to be debt free. We need to increase the debt. We need more debt. So we're going to cut taxes, increase spending, increase the deficit spending. That was the plan. I was explaining to you in the last podcast that Paul O'Neill, who was Bush's first Treasury Secretary, he wasn't in on the plan. He wasn't in on the plan at all. Here, let's listen to the clip that I have of Paul O'Neill here.
Well, Paul O'Neill spent 2 years as George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary. He was fired at the end of 2002 as part of a shakeup of the president's economic team. After he left office, O'Neill detailed many of his disagreements with the president. For one, he opposed many of the Bush tax cuts. O'Neill says he directly advised the president on multiple occasions against a further round of cuts. Yet President Bush remembers history differently in his recently published memoir, Decision Points. In fact, the president claims that O'Neill only expressed that opinion behind his back. I asked O'Neill to respond.
It's interesting. One of the things he says in the book is that the two of us never clicked. To that I would say, amen. I could never figure out how to have a logical, progressive conversation with him about anything. So it's true, we never really clicked. But he does say that he discovered from others, it got back to him in his words, that I didn't favor the third tax cut. Here's the truth. In April of 2002, in a meeting in his office, in the Oval Office with me.
April 2002.
And Secretary Don Evans, who was then Secretary of Commerce, and Andy Card, who was the Chief of Staff, and Karl Rove, and Larry Lindsay and Glenn Hubbard, who was then the head of the CEA, they were talking about we need to mount an effort for another round of tax cuts, and I said, clearly, I speak clearly, this is not a good idea for these reasons. We've just had 9/11. We could have another one of those. Cost of 9/11, $100 billion. We could have another one of those. There's a conversation about going to Iraq. God only knows how much that could cost.
You weren't supportive of that either.
No. There's a need for fundamental tax reform. There's a need for fixing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And rather than another tax cut, we should use the money you're talking about to deal with these other problems and have some money in case some of these other things happen.
That's just fiscally responsible. So that's just fiscally responsible. So Paul O'Neill, who was Treasury Secretary, he didn't understand that the game was to increase the debt. That we want to increase the debt on the country because the problem that we get from the secret document, life after death, the crisis that is ahead of us is that the United States is getting ready to be debt-free, is what these guys said. The United States is going to be debt-free. It's a crisis. So Paul O'Neill wasn't in on the fact that was the plan, that Paul O'Neill's saying that look, if we do this, you're doing more tax cuts. We're fighting a war in Afghanistan already. You're talking about taking us to Iraq. How much is that going to cost? The fundamentals of the economy. We have all of these corporations crashing all around us. Adelphia's crashing, Global Crossing's crashing, Enron's crashing, WorldCom's crashing. We have all these problems, and you want to cut taxes more? Paul O'Neill wasn't in on it, and he criticized Bush, and Bush fired him for it. So that's why I'm talking about the financial crisis. That's why I'm talking about the Fed policy and the power that the Fed has. Quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is monetary policy action where the central bank purchases predetermined amounts of government bonds and financial assets in order to stimulate the economy. This is what they did for Obama after 2008. Bernanke used quantitative easing to bring interest rates down for zero. That's why you only had this short little dip in the housing price. Look at the date. This is the on this. I'm not going to expand it, but if you look at this, this is the median price of housing. In 2009, the median price was $208,000, and this is the low point after the crash from 2009. And then what you see is the housing prices started rising again. Why did the housing prices start rising again here in 2009 is because Ben Bernanke implemented this policy of quantitative easing. Now, if the Fed would have not done this stimulus, and this is the stimulus that Peter Schiff is being critical of, if the Fed doesn't do this stimulus, then you have a deeper reduction here as a result of the financial crisis. You have a deeper reduction in the median price of housing. And then you have a deeper reduction than people are able to get in because the price of housing is coming down as a result of the crash, which we should have had. We should have had a longer recession instead of kicking the can down the road. But because of the Fed policy and the negative interest rates, what you see is the price of housing climbing. Now, are wages climbing at the same rate as the price of housing? No, the wages aren't climbing at this same rate as you see the price of housing climbing. You don't see that with wages because the negative interest rate doesn't affect wages. What affects wages is the open border. Reason wages are low are because of the open border. And that's why housing is unaffordable as well, is because of the open border. Even if this is the median price for buying a home, but even if you look at the chart for rents and the way that rents are increasing, the reason that rents are increasing the way they are is because you have all these people coming over the border. And what that is doing the basic economic principle is supply and demand. So if there's a finite amount of places to rent and you have more demand for those places because people are coming over the border, that's going to shoot up the prices of rent. I mean, so the open borders have a direct effect on the prices of housing right now because there's a limited amount of inventory. There's more demand for housing, no matter if you're buying or if you're renting, because of the open borders, and the open borders are keeping the wages low. So Kamala Harris, back to Kamala Harris and her campaign. She was on this Oprah Winfrey town hall last night, and she was asked directly about her policy to bring down the cost of housing. I want you to take a listen.
So, Madam Vice President, we are, like many, many young Americans, just experiencing a very high cost of living. We ended up giving up our apartment, moving in with our parents who were so gracious to take us in for over a year so that we could save money and ultimately buy a home, because that's what we thought the American dream was, to get married and buy a home and have a baby. And now here we are, and our mortgage is incredibly higher than what we thought it would be. And my sister and our brother-in-law are living with us right now so that they can hopefully one day do the same. And while it's beneficial for us because they help us pay off some of our mortgage, it's also beneficial for them because they can save on cheaper rent. But we really would love to know what your plan is to help lower the cost of living.
Yeah, first of all, thank you both for being here. And yours is a story I hear around the country as I travel. And in terms of both rightly having the right to have aspirations and dreams.
What did she just say? Rightly having the right to have aspirations and dreams. What?
This is a story I hear around the country as I travel. And in terms of both rightly having the right to have aspirations and dreams and ambitions for your family, and working hard and finding that the American dream is, for this generation and so many recently, far more elusive than it's been.
Yeah, because
and
of
we
you.
need to deal with that.
You and Biden.
And there are a number of ways. One is bringing down the cost of everyday necessities, including groceries. So that's why I'm taking on, for example, price gouging, which is when, most companies and corporations are good, but for those bad ones, they take advantage of people, especially during a pandemic or extreme weather, and they end up jacking up prices, and there needs to be accountability and consequence for that. So I'm going to be taking on price gouging.
Price fixing is what she's going to do. That's the central part of her economic plan. Ban corporate price gouging, price fixing. I haven't talked about that very much. Honestly, if you need me to explain why this is bad, you're listening to the wrong podcast. But price gouging is, and she's talking about grocery stores specifically, because food is not included in core inflation. Food is part of headline inflation. So the price of food is not coming down, because food is food. And that's why it's not included in core inflation, because food and energy is volatile, and it's especially volatile when you have inflation. So price gouging, that's part of her answer here, how she's going to help these people get a home, afford a home. It's ridiculous.
But it's also about dealing with what we need to do around home ownership, right? So as someone mentioned during this film, look, I grew up a child of a mother who worked very hard. She raised me and my sister, and I think they've told her not to say middle class anymore, that she came from a middle class, because people were calling her out on that. Like every time she answers, I came from a middle class home. But if you notice right here, it seems like she catches herself from going into that middle class talking point. This film, look, I grew up a child of a mother who worked very hard. She raised me and my sister, and she saved up, And by the time I was a teenager, she was able to buy a home. And we grew up actually for a long time in an apartment on top of a child care center that was owned by the woman we called our second mother because she helped my mother raise us. And she was a small business owner, Miss Shelton. So I'll bring all this together to tell you the way I think about it is, one, when people work hard and have a dream of buying a home, we should give you the opportunity to be able to do that, which is why part of my plan is for first-time homeowners, buyers, to have a $25,000 down payment assistance to buy your first home.
All right, down payment assistance.
People just need to be able to get their foot in the door, and then you'll do the hard work. Part of my plan is what we need to do to support small businesses because...
So listen to her. So the down payment assistance program was the centerpiece of George Bush's plan to get people into homes back in 2002, 2003. We listened to the speech from him at the end of last podcast. We're going to listen to a little bit more because the rhetoric that you hear Kamala Harris telling these people about how she's going to help them get into homes that they cannot afford. The median price of a home right now, the median price of a home in the United States, $400,000, $426,000. I don't know where these people live. It's a lot higher here in California. But she's telling them we're going to give you a $25,000 tax credit. Back in 2002, when George Bush was saying we need to get everybody in these homes, we need to, make it affordable. We need to, we're going to listen to the speech here again, but I'm going to tell you what he did. They created this word called creative financing. Creative financing came from the Bush administration. And they were the ones who were telling the lenders, we need you to come up with creative ways to finance these guys. That's why the lenders came up with the option arm and the no interest loan and all these creative ways to finance, to get these people in homes, because Bush needed to get all these borrowers. It didn't matter if they could afford the loans down the road or if they were going to, if they were going to end up, being foreclosed on down the road and lose their homes. None of that stuff matters. We need to just get them in now because I'm making the pitch to go to Iraq, and no one's going to support the war in Iraq if we're in recession. So Greenspan's going to cut rates. I'm going to create this bubble economy through the housing market, and we just need to get these loans written. So Bush came up with the idea of the creative financing, the down payment assistance, which was part of his program. Let me read the first paragraph here. On December 16th, 2003, George Bush signed into law the American Dream Down Payment Initiative, which was aimed at helping approximately 40,000 families a year with their down payment and closing costs to further strengthen America's housing market. Further strengthen America's housing market. You mean to further strengthen your gross domestic product so you could show GDP growth while you took us to an illegal war. That's what it was about. The legislation completed the legislation completed the president's aggressive agenda. This is in quotes. The president's aggressive agenda announced in a speech that he gave at the Department of Housing and Urban Development on June 18th, 2002. And this is the speech that he gave at HUD, June 2002. This is a month after he gave this speech that we listened to last week. It's the same speech, the same initiatives of his program to get people into homes.
I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream.
Now, how does this guy sound different? Listen to what this guy's saying in 2002, and you listen to what Kamala Harris is saying now about the American dream and telling these people, I just want you to listen to Kamala Harris again before you listen to Bush, because I want you to notice the similarities in what she's saying and what Bush says.
So that's why I'm taking on, for example, price gouging. which is when, most companies and corporations are good, but for those bad ones, they take advantage of people, especially during a pandemic or extreme weather, and they end up jacking up prices, and there needs to be accountability and consequence for that. So I'm going to be taking on price gouging. But it's also about dealing with what we need to do around home ownership, right? So as someone mentioned during this film, look, I grew up a child of a mother who worked very hard. She raised me and my sister, and she saved up, and by the time I was a teenager, she was able to buy a home. And we grew up actually for a long time in an apartment on top of a child care center that was owned by the woman we called our second mother because she helped my mother raise us. And she was a small business owner, Miss Shelton. So I'll bring all this together to tell you the way I think about it is, one, when people work hard and have a dream of buying a home, we should give you the opportunity to be able to do that, which is why part of my plan is for first-time homeowners, buyers, to have a $25,000 down payment assistance to buy your first home.
Tax credit.
Because people just need to be able to get their foot in the door, and then you'll do the hard work. Part of my plan is what...
So you just need to be able to get your foot in the door, and then you do the hard work. Yeah, the hard work's going to come after that $25,000 down payment assistance, paying that mortgage every month. That's going to be the hard work. Because look at this. This is the median price of homes in the United States. Why do you think you see it coming down right here a little bit? Why do you think it came down right here? This is in 2002. So the reason it started coming down right here is because the Fed, Jerome Powell, started raising rates right here, or 2022. So this is 2022. This is the year after Biden did and Kamala Harris did the American Rescue, created, all of this inflation. And then this is the point where Powell starts raising rates. And then when he starts raising rates, you see it coming down right here. Let's listen to Bush. I want you to hear how similar what he was saying in 2002 is to what Kamala Harris was just saying.
I believe those of us who have been given positions of responsibility must do everything we can to spotlight the dream and to make sure the dream shines in all neighborhoods, all throughout our country. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream. And so here are some of the ways to address the issue. First, the single greatest barrier to first-time home ownership is a high down payment. It is really hard for many, many low-income families to make the high down payment. And so that's why I've proposed and urged Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment. And that's important. If one of the barriers to home ownership is the inability to make a down payment, and if one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment. And we want to make the plan more robust. We want to make it more full all across America. Secondly, there is a lack of affordable housing in certain neighborhoods. Too many neighborhoods, especially in inner city America, lack affordable housing units.
More inventory. It's Kamala's plan. We need to build more, use government money or government influence to build more inventory.
How can you promote home ownership if people can't afford the home? And so what I've done is propose what we call a single-family affordable housing tax credit to encourage the development of affordable housing in neighborhoods where housing is scarce. A third major barrier is the complexity and difficulty of the home buying process.
Get rid of fine print.
There's a lot of fine print.
Too much fine print
on these forms. And it bothers people. It makes them nervous. And so therefore, what Mel has agreed to do and Alphonso Jackson have agreed to do is to streamline the process, make the rules simpler.
Make the rules
Everybody
simpler.
understands what they are.
Make the rules
Makes
simpler.
the closing much less complicated. We certainly don't want there to be a fine print preventing people from owning their home. We can change the print. And so these are important initiatives that we can do at the federal government. And the federal government obviously has to play an important role. And we will. We will. I mean, when I lay out a goal, I mean it.
The federal government has to play an important role, is what he says. Yeah, they played a big role in the housing market, 2002.
Print.
The market crashed. This market that he's building up, that he's talking about here, this market crashed just 6 months later, 6 years later. But he didn't care about that. He'd already used it for what he wanted to use it for. He wanted to use it to show GDP growth and to show that despite his tax cuts, despite taking us to war, that he was able to show that the economy was growing. I love people talk all the time and use his tax cuts as evidence of how tax cuts, are good for the economy. And don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong about any of this, people. I'm happy. I want the interest rate to be lower. I wish we had interest rates that were still at 3%, but I wish that the entire structure of our economy was of such to where that was the prudent and fiscally responsible place for interest rates to be right now is at 3%. With the debt the way that it is, with inflation the way that it is, then you can't have 3% interest rate right now. But yes, I want the interest rate to be at 3%. I want a lower interest rate. I'm happy that the interest rate is lower, but I'm not happy that Jerome Powell is acting political 50 days before the election, lowering the interest rate, and it has nothing to do with with where the economy is. And tax cuts. I am for tax cuts. I hate taxes. I'm glad that George W. Bush cut taxes, but don't cut taxes and take us to an illegal war. I don't want the taxes to be cut if you're gonna run up the debt to $35 trillion. So don't get me wrong. I don't have a problem with tax cuts, but like Paul O'Neill, I have a problem with tax cuts if the economy is not in a place where and the country is not in a place where cutting taxes is the most prudent thing to do. So this marketplace that he was creating, well, he was creating it so he could show. And I was going back to say that I've had people and I've heard tons of people say that evidence of tax cuts being good or the fact that George W. Bush had this booming economy after the tax cuts. But George Bush's economy was built on this fraudulent housing market. I mean, so you can't say that it was because of the tax cuts, because you also have this variable that he was creating this fraudulent housing market to benefit from to justify the tax cuts. Listen to a little bit.
And Alphonso Jackson have agreed to do is to streamline the process, make the rules simpler so everybody understands what they are, makes the closing much less complicated. We certainly don't want there to be a fine print preventing people from owning their home. We can change the print. And so these are important initiatives that we can do at the federal government. And the federal government obviously has to play an important role. And we will. We will. I mean,
the federal government they're not the only ones who play a important role. The Federal Reserve, which is not federal at all. A lot of people get confused by the name because it's called the Federal Reserve, think that the Federal Reserve is federal, but it's not federal. The Federal Reserve is private. And the Federal Reserve, along with the federal government, played a big role in creating this housing bubble. And this guy, Alan Greenspan, who George Bush gives the Medal of Freedom, he played a big role. And we were talking about derivatives. We talked about TARP in the last two podcasts, and we were talking about the fact that TARP created or not created, it allowed $700 billion for the then Fed chair, Henry Paulson, and the then Fed chair, Ben Bernanke, and the then Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson, to purchase different types of troubled assets. Were residential and commercial obligations. And like I was explaining and been explaining, these assets still had value. If your mortgage was underwater, you have to short sell. Bank's going to take the property. They're still going to be able to sell it. I mean, the value of the property is still there. The property's still going to have value. Just, I mean, these mortgages were underwater. We had to restructure them or take the property. Still going to be able to sell them. But the B troubled assets were these financial instruments, and we talked about these financial instruments. We talked about derivatives in the last podcast. We talked about CDOs and mortgage-backed securities. But we're going to talk a little bit more about derivatives as we wind up in this podcast, because these derivatives we explained in the last podcast and the podcast before that. What's his name? Warren Buffett called these financial weapons of mass destruction back in 2002.
Function, why on earth there are so much of them, and why Warren Buffett called them financial weapons of mass destruction in his 2002 shareholder letter, and warned that
derivatives could accentuate in a major way a systemic problem that might even arise from some other phenomenon.
While at the same time, he also really likes to use them.
What's his history with derivatives?
Well, he has a checkered history with derivatives.
We have 200. I know every single derivative we own.
You don't know anything about derivatives? Good news, I'll tell you. Sit back, relax, grab some popcorn and listen. The word derivative comes from the word derive, which comes from the Latin word derivare, which actually comes from the ancient Egyptian word for nobody cares. In the case of financial derivatives, this simply means that you create a piece of paper which derives its value from a so-called underlying asset. Company shares, a house, crude oil, your student debt, no kidding, pretty much anything can be used as the basis for a financial derivative.
So we were talking about, and then he says even another derivative.
Even, wait for it, another derivative.
So the underlying asset for a derivative can be stock, it can be house or the housing market, which I believe these derivatives that took down our economy in 2008, these derivatives were tied to either CDOs or mortgage-backed securities. They can be tied to commodities. They can be tied to education, student loan debt. They can be tied to even other derivatives. A derivative can be tied to any other assets, and it's a derivative of that asset. You have to know the value of the underlying asset to know the asset of the derivatives. So now we're going to talk about a certain type of derivatives, and these are derivatives that took down our economy in 2008, and these are called over-the-counter derivatives. And over-the-counter derivatives, over-the-counter speaks to the marketplace where these derivatives are sold and traded, and it is a private marketplace. It's a marketplace that is set up without any regulation. Rich people were trading and selling these derivatives to one another without any regulation from the SEC, from any government agency. Completely over the counter just means private. That trillions of dollars, billions of dollars was being traded, and this marketplace, this over the counter marketplace, where these derivatives were being traded. It seems criminal. It seems like that this should have been regulated. These financial instruments took down our economy, and we'll probably explain more about how this happened in the next podcast. But I just want you to go further into what these things are and what these guys did. These guys, because yes, these derivatives, this over-the-counter marketplace should have been regulated. And in the Clinton administration, one woman tried to regulate these derivatives in the 1990s, and these men prevented her from doing it because they were setting up the crash. Let's listen to this clip about Brooksley Born.
Long before the economic meltdown, the story of one woman who tried to warn about the threat to the financial system.
She saw something that people either had not seen or refused to see. And she tried to sound the warning. Nobody listened.
What are you trying to protect?
We're trying to protect the money of the American public.
I was told that she was irascible, difficult, stubborn, unreasonable.
Before the toxic assets poisoned the economy, she warned of their danger.
And that made her the enemy of a very, very large number of people.
She would fight an epic battle with one of the most powerful men in Washington.
He was, as George Bush put it at the time, a rock star. It got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Greenspan turns to her, she turns to him. His face is red, and he's clearly quite upset.
A story from inside the highest levels of the Clinton administration.
They were all part of a very concerted effort to shut her up and to shut her down. And they did, in fact, shut her up and shut her down.
So,
tonight on Frontline,
Brooksley Born,
Greenspan, Brooksley Born, and the warning.
Brooksley Born tried to warn the Clinton administration, and she was warning of these derivatives and this over-the-counter marketplace and saying this is dangerous, this is unregulated, and just like Warren Buffett said, these are financial weapons of mass destruction, and she tried to regulate them back in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, and Alan Greenspan and Larry Summers and Robert Rubin and Timothy Geithner, they all worked to prevent her from regulating these derivatives. Here's another clip.
From the beginning, Clinton aimed to reassure powerful forces on Wall Street. And he did so with a key appointment.
I asked Robert Rubin to serve as assistant to the president for economic policy.
Rubin is the best-known financier in the country at that point because he had run the legendary Goldman Sachs.
Bob Rubin was Bill Clinton's emissary to Wall Street. Clinton placed great trust in Bob Rubin and Bob Rubin's view of financial markets and financial regulation.
He had an enormous amount of credibility because he was a business success, and Democratic administrations always seem to worship people who can excel at business.
At the White House, and as Treasury Secretary, Rubin found an unlikely ally. Clinton had asked Alan Greenspan to stay on.
Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan were very much in lockstep. They had very similar views on Wall Street. It boiled down to the less regulation, the better.
And Rubin populated the Clinton administration with a network of free market true believers.
It wasn't just Rubin and Greenspan who were these free market acolytes. That thinking pervaded the Treasury and the White House.
Among Rubin's acolytes, 35-year-old Timothy Geithner, and Rubin's top deputy, the outspoken Harvard economist Larry Summers.
Summers is tough. Summers is very blunt-spoken, doesn't suffer fools lightly or anyone else, as the saying goes.
Bob Rubin is not a guy who likes confrontation. He's confrontation averse. But he understands that you need someone in there who can swing a heavy axe. And that person was Larry Summers. He was the enforcer.
Together, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers formed their own pro-business, anti-regulation support group.
They're the committee to save the world, according to the Time magazine cover. These are the people we turn to at that moment. Who
so
together,
this,
all three in a way.
Ron Siskine, I told you about the book a few podcasts ago that he wrote, the 1% Doctrine. That's the book about the Bush Doctrine. There's a 1% chance that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and it has to be treated as a certainty. Ron Siskine wrote that book. He wrote about the CIA agents coming to Bush's ranch at Crawford, Texas, with the August 6th PDB, Presidential Daily Briefing, that was titled "Bin Laden is Determined to Attack in the United States," and they were preparing to hijack planes. And Siskine is the one who writes from the anonymous source, that Bush looked at the CIA briefers and said, okay, you've covered your ass now. So this is another book that Siskine wrote called The Price of Loyalty. And The Price of Loyalty is a book about Paul O'Neill, and Paul O'Neill refusing to condone Bush's tax cuts and the fiscal policy of George Bush, and criticizing his tax cuts and being fired. So that's what The Price of Loyalty is about. So that's who Siskine is. So all of these guys, this documentary called The Warning is about how all of these guys in the Clinton administration, Robert Rubin, Alan Greenspan, Larry Summers, Timothy Geithner, how they worked to block Brooks Lee Bourne from regulating these financial weapons of mass destruction, these derivatives that took down our economy. I have a little bit more to play here from this documentary, and then this is the last clip. I'll play us out, but it just talks a little bit about what these derivatives did. We'll talk more about this probably in the next podcast.
She was determined that her agency would investigate fraud at the first opportunity. One area that caught her attention was a new and highly lucrative market, over-the-counter derivatives.
She starts to realize that there's this whole world out there of what are called over-the-counter derivatives that are essentially unregulated. It's not even that they're unregulated, it's that the government doesn't even know what's going on.
My staff began to say how big this was and how little information they had about it.
On Wall Street, they described it as a black box. Only the parties involved in a deal knew what was happening.
The derivatives market was a market that was not well understood, was growing rapidly, that had a few really smart, aggressive, innovative players.
Derivatives, swaps, basically bets between companies and banks, laying off risk.
Derivatives, in essence, are insurance policies that various players on Wall Street enter into to protect themselves from unforeseen calamities.
It was a $27 trillion market.
27 trillion dollars. People, $27 trillion in the early 2000s is what this derivative out of sight, completely private black box is what they're calling it. Black box marketplace of $27 trillion. Do you understand what I'm saying? And this woman was trying to regulate it in the Clinton administration, and they stopped her. These guys. Where are they at? These guys stopped her from regulating this black box marketplace that had $27 trillion in these weapons, financial weapons of mass destruction, is what Warren Buffett called them.
Wall Street enter into to protect themselves from unforeseen calamities.
It was a $27 trillion market, happening out of sight, inside a black box.
We didn't truly know the dangers in the market because it was a dark market. There was no transparency.
The conditions were very favorable for things to go wrong.
And they did go wrong.
Investigators learned there was also plenty of room for old-fashioned fraud.
A lot of fraud.
Major scandal at Bankers Trust.
Major scandal. We're going to talk about the scandal. We're going to talk more about derivatives. We're going to talk about Bankers Trust in the next podcast. Folks, this was a scandal. This was a scandal. And I'm talking about this because all of these people have endorsed Kamala Harris. And there's so many parallels between what she is talking about today and what happened back then. I got to explain to you what these guys did to us. It didn't just happen. They set it up to happen. And all three of these presidents right here, played a role. All three of these guys. I'll see you guys next time.